Today, we bring you an extraordinary story, the story of a man whose journey has crossed borders, cultures, and lifetimes of wisdom. This is Ward, a Westerner who since his younger days has traveled across the world, guided by a deep spiritual calling. From distant monasteries to mountain paths, he has met many great Buddhist masters, receiving teachings and empowerments that shaped his life. Today, Ward lives peacefully in the beautiful town of Maleni in the Sunshine State with his wife, carrying with him decades of memories, devotion, and lessons from his remarkable journey. In today's episode, we explore this story, a story of faith, discovery, and the beauty of a life lived with purpose. Join us as we share the inspiring story of Ward here on Himalayan Tales. Hello, Ward.
Hello.
Welcome to Himalayan Tales.
Thank you.
We're very grateful to you and your wife Mim for having us over. And we're very grateful to you for willing to spare your precious time and sharing your story with us on Himalayan Tales. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
To begin with, I'd like to ask, how long have you been a Buddhist practitioner?
There's a funny story. When I was in grade 6, elementary school, they passed out a form. And I was supposed to fill out the form and give it back to the school. So it was my name, my address, my parents' names and address, and then it had a place for religion. And for some reason I wrote Buddhist. I didn't know anything about Buddhism. I had really only heard of it. And anyway, that form went to the teacher, and then it went to the principal, and then it came back to my mother, and they said, "Why is your son a Buddhist, not a Christian?" And I really couldn't explain, but anyway, that doesn't mean anything. It's just something that happened to me. But to answer your question, I think probably about over 50 years.
Thank you for sharing that with us.
It's okay.
I'd like to ask, how did you begin your journey into Buddhism?
Well, it's probably all the things that led up to it. My actual journey of Buddhism, I suppose, began when I first took refuge. And that would have been in 1974, 75, with Kalu Rinpoche in Sonada, just outside of Darjeeling in northern India. But what led up to that is probably more significant. And I could probably say that there were a number of factors, as there are with everyone. Karma, of course. But, you know, I had grown up, I was born in 1949, and I was 6 months old. My father left our family. And I was raised by my mother, she was a single parent. And we lived just outside of Chicago, south of Chicago. I had been born in the South, but my father was in the service, so we ended up going nearby my mother's mother, my grandmother, where she lived. I can remember those years, my younger years, you know, and to sum it up, I think I was troubled. I think I struggled. I was really overweight, and, you know, growing up, I have a lot of fond memories, but I also remember these things. Eventually, we moved down to Florida, and when I got to Florida, I was a bit of a troubled teen. I made it through high school. I actually made it into university. I struggled a lot. I almost dropped out. I had a lot of personal problems. But what was happening concurrently was it was the 60s. So it was the hippie time. I graduated from high school in 1967, the summer of love. So I was being affected by and influenced by Eastern philosophy, different points of view. A lot of things were coming my way as far as art, creativity, thought, and these things were changing my outlook. And one of the things that I started to get interested in was Eastern philosophy. And probably like a lot of people of my generation, I read Paramahansa Yogananda, Shivananda, Muktananda, Baba Ram Das, And also at university, I was studying philosophy, and I had a philosophy professor, Thomas Hanna, and he used to give a yoga class. So I went to the yoga class and I started learning about yoga. And a big influence from mainstream Eastern thought was very, 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 very prevalent at that time. Anyway, so when I finished university, I started to look for work, and I'd heard about something that was happening in Europe, and there was a series of jazz festivals. I was very interested in music, and I had written actually quite a few articles about music. So I decided to travel to make an application, and I was fortunate enough to land a job covering the Montreux Jazz Festival in Switzerland. So I went over to Europe, and I traveled around Europe. I covered that jazz festival, and I also went to a couple others in Copenhagen and in Amsterdam. And along the way, I kept meeting young people my age or a little younger, a little older of my generation, who were hippies on the road, who were traveling on the road. There was a huge movement going overland back and forth at the time. And I would see them in their exotic clothes and their exotic dress. And I said, wow, where have you just been? They said, oh, we went through Turkey and Afghanistan and Iran, and we went to India. And I thought, well, that sounds good. And I had some money that I just earned, so I set out traveling. And one of the things that I had really looked into when I was at university was Sufi thought, sort of esoteric side of Islam. And I had read a lot of Mevlana Rumi. So I went to Konya, Turkey, and I went and saw the whirling dervishes and I went to Rumi's tomb, and I did things like that. And from there, I got more interested in Sufism. When I went to Iran, I traveled up north, south, along the border of the Caspian Sea. I met Sufi communities there. I met Baha'is in Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northern Pakistan. I again met people who were influenced by Sufi thought. And at one stage, I met a man named Iqbal Qadir, and he was a linguist, and he worked at the Lahore Museum. And I used to go into the museum, and I used to spend afternoons drinking tea and talking to him. And he told me about a place where he had gone, and where there was a lake in northern Pakistan. And around the lake, there were the ruins of 40 old Buddhist monasteries. And interestingly enough, in the Lahore Museum, one of their most prized exhibits is the statue of a fasting Buddha, where you can see all the ribs and the skin is stretched. And this has been depicted in many, many instances by Buddhists in different countries. But that's the first time that I ever laid eyes on that. He was a big influence in me, and he started to kindle an interest in me about the spread of Buddhism up through Central Asia, and then, of course, into Afghanistan. And I had been to Bamiyan and seen the standing Buddhas there in Afghanistan. So I think the viewing of these Buddhist statues, definitely, liberation by seeing, if you will, had a great influence on me. Anyway, so I spent time with them, and I went to Kalandaz, and I attended the initiation of the Sufi novices, where these are like Sufi ascetics, and they live in the woods, very much like Hindu sadhus, and they practice austerity. So they have to do it for 7 years. So, for instance, there was one fellow who kept a fire burning for 7 years. There was one fellow who didn't speak for 7 years. There was one fellow, believe it or not, who stood on one leg, only used one leg for 7 years. So these chaps had undergone a lot of austerities, and at this place called Kalandas, which is the home of Shahbaz Kalandas, who was a great Sufi mystic, they gathered every 7 years, and they have a rite of passage. So where the the adepts, the young ascetics, sort of transfer into adulthood and become full-fledged, if you will, Sufi practitioners. So I was one of the first foreign people to attend this. And I can remember it was 3 days of mayhem and dancing, and, you know, mountains of charas was smoked and feasts and all this. And, you know, I felt that was like a bit of a spiritual turning point for me, and I felt energized. So my influences in at university and Eastern thought and Hindu thought and Sufi thought in my travels started to actually start to come to a head. Anyway, I went into India, and when I went to India, I went to Bodh Gaya, and I went to Vulture's Peak and Rajgir and Sarnath and these places. And I did this from a historical perspective, as these were important places to visit as a tourist, as a traveler in the East. I didn't really know yet that this was planting seeds. When I went up to Nepal, and by now I think we're talking 1973, end of 73, of course I went to Bodhanath, and I went to Swayambhu, and I went to Rewalsar, Parping, and again as a tourist. And I did some treks in Nepal. I went up to Muktinath, and I kept bumping into people of all different tribes and castes and ethnic groups throughout Nepal, and I got a taste of the difference, you know, Newari Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, people in Dolpo, all these different cultural influences I was absorbing. I thought I was just a hippie, you know, having fun, eating pie and smoking hash, but things started to build up. Anyway, then I went to Burma, I went to Shwedagon Pagoda, and then I traveled through Southeast Asia quite extensively. But I kept ending up in places like Pagan in Burma, where the stupas were, in Mandalay Hill. And then when I went to Bangkok, Wat Po, Wat Arun, I kept ending up in these Buddhist places and finding myself in Buddhist temples, Buddhist stupas, and I started to see the monks and see the ascetic nature of the practice, and my whole spiritual turning was starting to become a lot more complete. Went to Indonesia. I went to a place in Sumatra where the Sultan of Johor, or was Sultan of Sumatra, had built a Buddhist relic. I went to Borobudur, et cetera, et cetera. When I got to Bali, I should back up. I was in Java, in Eastern Java, in Surabaya. And it was the celebration of the end of Ramadan, their fasting. And there were fireworks and there were craziness outside. I was at a hotel, and I was probably the only foreigner around. And I went out to get something to eat, and they were throwing firecrackers at me, and I was scared, you know, and it was quite oppressive. The next day I got in a tuk-tuk and shot down to the docks to get a ferry over to Bali. And I was in a very, very bad state of mind. I was very upset, very negative thoughts, and just wanted to get out of there. And when I got on the ferry, there was a young Chinese man, and he had a black beret and a black sweater and a very open, friendly face. And he came up to me and he said, "Are you okay, brother?" And I turned to him and I said, "Piss off. Leave me alone. Go away. I don't want to talk to you." I really was fed up. I wasn't in a good state of mind. So I went and sat on the other side of the boat. And just as we were coming into the docks in Bali, he came in and he sat next to me and he looked me in the eye and he said, "Don't worry, brother. I am just like you." And I thought, "What do you mean you're just like me?" And he said, "I too am a refugee." Anyway, he said, "Where are you going now?" I said, "Well, I think I'm going to Denpasar because I want to get something to eat." He said, "Why don't you come with me?" He said, "I have a place up in Singaraja." And he said, "It's near the ocean." He said, it's away from all the tourists. He said, if you come up there, I can offer you a room, you can relax. And, you know, a lot of people would say, well, what are you on about? What is this? Are you setting me up for a robbery? What's going on here? You know, but I just let go and I said, okay. So we left the boat and we jumped in a little minibus and we traveled up and we arrived. And when we arrived at a Chinese Buddhist monastery in Singaraja. And I said, is this your place? He goes, this is where I stay. So he took me in and he showed me a room and it was all beautifully clean and a bed and everything. And I went out and we had some food together and I went back in my room and I slept. And the next morning it was very, very early. And I got up and I went outside my room and I heard some clapping. And I walked out and there in front of a large statue of Buddha, on the altar, was a man standing in his robes, and he was in the robes and the dress of a Zen Roshi. And I walked and I came up behind. I was probably 20 feet from him, and it turned around and it was my friend. And he finished what he was doing, his prayers, and then he came over to me and he said, maybe I should introduce myself. My name is Handojo Zenzi, and I'm the Zen Patriarch of Indonesia. And I went, okay, now you tell me. Anyway, so I stayed with him for 3 or 4 days, and then he said, go be a hippie, go have fun. So I went down to Bali and partied and had fun, and then I flew into Australia. I didn't have any money left, and Australia was a Western country where I could get a job and earn some more money to continue my travels. So I stayed in Australia for 9 months, and when I went down to Melbourne, I was reunited with 2 friends of mine, Simon Johnston and Mick Bandy. And Mick Bandy had gone through Nepal and he had taken a meditation course at Kopan Monastery. So we got a house down in Melbourne together, and Mick had a visitor one night, and it was a young guy by the name of Dave Christensen. And Dave had also done that same meditation course, and they were talking about Buddhist things, Buddhist subjects. And an aside here, at that time, Dave had been dating the woman who would eventually become my wife, Mim Colstock. And Mim was actually living just around the corner from, I was on Lygon Street, she was over on Rathdown or Drummond Street, which was a 5-minute walk. And I didn't know she was there. But I did meet a woman by the name of Phoebe Harper. And we became very good friends, and we became romantically involved. And then we thought, okay, what do we do? And I said, well, I'm going back to Asia. And she had been working and she had saved some money. So off we went. Anyway, I won't go through the intricacies of our trip back, but just suffice to say, we traveled through New Guinea and all through Indonesia by boats, hopping from one to the next. And we went through Thailand, and then Burma, and then we flew into Calcutta. And when we got to Calcutta, we met somebody who said, hey, are you going to the meditation course? And we said, well, we don't know anything about meditation course. And they said, well, there's a man and his name is S.N. Goenka. And he teaches Buddhist meditation, and he's giving a course. So we thought, that sounds good. Here we are. And so we went off, and finally he held this. We didn't know that Goenka at the time was a very wealthy and successful industrialist. And he had met his teacher and had learned a a technique of meditation called vipassana. Now, I would learn later that it was probably more like shamatha meditation. Vipassana in Tibetan, of course, is a latong. And then later on, when I took latong teachings, I thought, oh, no. What I learned from Goenka was actually jine or shamatha. So anyway, not that that matters. The point is that we did the course with Goenka, and it was very strict. Men and women separated, no talking, no nothing. You ate a very strict diet, and you did your sessions very specifically. Just like a Tibetan psalm would be broken up into 4 sections of the day, 4 3-hour sessions. We were sort of doing 4 2-hour or 1.5 or 2-hour sessions. So this was the first time we had actually experienced this sort of real boundary in meditation. And it was tough and it was hard. And after the 7 days were over, I think we went straight away and we went to Khan Market and got a great big gigantic bowl of ice cold mishti doi, sweet yogurt, but it was a very moving, very, very, very wonderful experience. And after that, we wanted to go up to Darjeeling. And we had heard a lot about Darjeeling, and it was warm on the plains of India. So we went up to Darjeeling, and we were in winter. And when we first got to Darjeeling, we were absolutely freezing. We were staying in a little guest house. Now, keep in mind in these days, and this is no exaggeration, you could travel around India on a few dollars a day, literally a few US dollars a day. You could travel, you could eat, you could stay in cheap accommodation. It was a type of freedom that I don't know whether that exists economically anywhere on the planet anymore, but at that time and that place. And I have to say that you asked me, what contributed to my Buddhist studies? Well, what contributed to my Buddhist studies, I'll just stop and say this now, was it was a particular time in history when that sort of mobility was available. And it was a particular time in history when one could abandon particular responsibilities. I mean, I had friends who said to me, you've just left university. You've got, a couple of university degrees. You should go into the workforce. You should, plan for your future. You should do this. And little did I know at that time I was doing the best thing I could do for my future from the ultimate point of view. And the other thing that I reflected on later when I heard this quote, and I heard this quote I read this quote, and at the time it was attributed to Kyabje Dudjom Rinpoche. Now, I'm not exactly sure whether it's actually Kyabje Dudjom Rinpoche repeating the words of the Buddha, but from the mouth of Kyabje Dudjom Rinpoche, leaving one's homeland is half the Dharma. And I really realized that breaking so many of I'm not going to call them chains or ropes or ties or anything to my country. That wasn't so much it. It was making the decision to set out and do something. Some people might call it brave. It didn't seem like it. Something different, something radical compared to what one is doing. So I think that's really a key here. All these words that have brought me to this point it's key to take the leap. And in my case, there wasn't a lot of faith required because the development of my own journey, because of my own karma, because of my own suffering. What caused me to be a seeker was it started out maybe as an intellectual pursuit, but it ultimately would fall into the classification of the situations that Lord Buddha described when he talked about the Four Noble Truths. The truth is suffering. So I probably caused a lot of suffering by leaving my family. My mother was alone. However, that was what happened. Anyway, so here we are in Darjeeling. We were staying in a little tiny hotel without a heater, thin walls. We were freezing. Both of our sleeping bags weren't big enough. And we met a couple, and it was a German woman and her boyfriend. And we decided to share the room with them because it was more cozy, and they were interesting. And also they were going to cook some spaghetti, so we thought, bonus. And she said, have you heard about the Lama who lives down the road? And we said, no, we hadn't. Well, little did we know that at that time, Kanjur Rinpoche was around the corner at 54 Gandhi Road, and Jatro Rinpoche was in Goom. And the Lama she was speaking of was Kalu Rinpoche, and he was in Sonada. So she said, well, he's there and he has been teaching Western people. So we thought, all right. So we took a bus down to Sonada and we showed up and we got a little room there. And when we checked into the hotel, we met another person. And this person was a Westerner. He was an Englishman, and he'd actually been studying Dharma for a year or something, and been around India, and he had some books. And, the kindness of strangers. What leads you to these things? These people were the Sangha along the way. And so we went and we met Kalu Rinpoche, and we heard some talks, and he was at that time had a translator, and we ended up taking refuge. And we took refuge with Kalu Rinpoche, and we hung around Darjeeling and hung around the Sonada area for probably a month, took teachings from Kalu Rinpoche, and it was time to leave because in those days, Darjeeling was considered a sensitive area because of its proximity to China, Sikkim, and areas of dispute. And so our permits were finished, and we didn't feel like we wanted to go back down to all the way to Calcutta and go through the red tape. And so we went and saw Kalu Rinpoche, and we said, "Can you give us some direction?" Oh, and what I should jump in here and say is, while we were staying in Darjeeling, we went back to Darjeeling, and we used to go to a little Tibetan shop, and we met a Tibetan man there. And his shop was full of treasures. Now you have to remember, back in the early 70s, there were so many more, well, the Tibetan diaspora, the Tibetans who had fled Tibet had settled throughout Himalayan areas. And many of these people brought what they could carry with them. And often that included the family jewels, literally the family jewels. And he had a shop full of all kinds of beautiful things, and we used to go in and look at them. And so I remember I bought a mala. And he had some bells and dorjes and things that we really didn't know anything about. And they were very expensive for us as travelers. And I said to him, where could I get a bell and dorje? And he gave me the address of a statue maker in Bhutia Basti. So we came back. We left Bhutia Basti, and I had the Buddha statue and my new bell and dorje. And I went back to Sonada to see Kalu Rinpoche. And I asked Kalu Rinpoche to consecrate and bless them. And he had a twinkle in his eye and a little smile on his face. And I didn't know how to interpret it. I think he was either saying, what do you think you're going to do with that bell and dorje, you little pipsqueak? Or he was happy that I had bought these things. Nonetheless, he consecrated them and we took them. And then my friend Phoebe and I, we traveled to Nepal. We rented a funky house out in the middle of the rice paddies. And we got there, and they were putting the finishing touches to a monastery which is widely known as the White Gompa in Bodhanath. And this was the monastery of Tuku Urgyen Rinpoche and his two sons, Chukyinima Rinpoche and Choling Rinpoche. And there was some painting to be done and a few last-minute arrangements, and so we kind of helped with that. And then His Holiness Karmapa arrived, and, well, history will tell you about the 16th Karmapa and his presence and his majesty and his power. That's all legend. But until you experience it yourself, it's really something. And the wongs that he was giving was the Kagyu Natsa. And it's one of the 5 treasuries of Jong Control. And because of the significance of the initiations, and because that it is not given that often, many young tulkus and many high Rinpoches came to receive it. So basically, all of the leading lamas of the Kamsang Kagyu sect came. So, of course, Karmapa came, Shama Rinpoche came, Gyaltsab Rinpoche came, Jamgon Kongtrul came, Birukenzi came, Dabzang Rinpoche came, Sakchu Rinpoche came, and then many other tulkus from other sects. Zonsar Kenzi Rinpoche came. A dozen young tulkus whose names I have written down somewhere, but I can't remember. But suffice to say, there were 20 major young tulkus there to receive the initiation. So it was quite an unbelievable experience. His Holiness was so kind that he made an area of seating just for Westerners. And there were probably about 25, 30, I would say, Westerners there. And this is where we first came in contact with, or I first came into contact with, Western students who had been studying Dharma for quite a while, who actually had done translating and who had done retreats and practice, and who were quite knowledgeable. So there was an amazing exchange of information, and I was just trying to suck it up like a sponge. And the initiations went on for about 5 or 6 weeks, and almost every day, and certainly on the break days that we had, His Holiness would do his black crown ceremony. And people would come from all over Nepal. And so usually the Lakang, it was a very large Lakang. The Lakang was full. The courtyard was full. People were standing outside. Anybody who could hear or see this experience did. And I was fortunate enough to see dozens of these black crown ceremonies, and it was amazing experience. Also, before and after the initiations, we had access to some of the lamas we could talk to about our practice, or about, at that stage, I really didn't have a practice, but we were starting to see the way things were falling into place. So I had a good relationship with Shama Rinpoche, with Jamgon Kongtrul especially, because his English was very, very good, which was a benefit in those times. And we made friendships with so many Dharma friends and Dharma students around the world, who, people from all nationalities who had come to receive these initiations. And after the initiations finished, Trungpa Rinpoche, Khenpo Trungpa Rinpoche, was instructed by His Holiness Karmapa to give teachings, and he taught us the Gyu Lama. And we had Matthew Kapstein, who was a renowned translator and student of Tibetan Buddhism, as a translator, and a number of us students were fortunate enough to receive those teachings. we also got to know the Kalu lamas who lived in and around the Kathmandu area, notably Damson Rinpoche and Sakshi Rinpoche from Swayambhu. Sakshi Rinpoche was very gruff and very unapproachable. Damson Rinpoche was the complete opposite, and it was only later that I found out what a great master and what a great yogi he was, and he was wonderful. It was a wonderful experience. Also during that time, some of the great lamas from other sects came, and it was one weekend afternoon was the first time that I ever saw Kyabje Dujam Rinpoche. And it's very memorable. If I close my eyes, I can still see it now. And when Rinpoche, we had heard stories about him. And when Rinpoche arrived, he pulled up in an old Mercedes that was a very vivid green color, which was unique in itself. And he arrived with his two daughters and his attendant and his driver. And I remember when the door opened and out stepped this very elegant, diminutive person. He was not a huge man. He was small, but beautifully dressed in a long sort of terracotta or golden chuba, his hair perfectly tied back, his glasses and his beautiful polished shoes. And he was immaculate. And he got out of the car and he moved with this grace, and it was quite breathtaking. And His Holiness Karmapa had come down, and Dujam Rinpoche ascended the stairs in front of the Gompa and started walking up the path. There was a long brick path before the Lakam door, and His Holiness Karmapa came down, and they met in the middle and touched heads and exchanged katas and said a few words, and then they went into the Gompa, and that was as far as any of us could go. But I'll remember that forever. Seeing that exchange of respect and grace. Pretty amazing. Anyway, one of the real beauties of the time, and I'm sure it still exists today in Bodhanath. I mean, I haven't been to Bodha for 5 years or something, 6 years, but what always was so impressive about it was, the stupa was like this tower, radio tower, where the electric current, it attracted this power, and it was the epicenter of this and everything around it, from the local people or the Tibetan refugees or the people who came down from the mountains to venerate and to pray at the Bodhistupa, and the many monasteries. And even in those days, there was a small Kagyu monastery, and then now with the building of Tupu Urgyen's monastery, and Western people who came from all over the world. So after the Wongs, after the day of sitting through the initiations, the coffee shops and the restaurants, and like the beer restaurant. I mean, I think I still hold the record for eating momos at the beer restaurant. But, you would be sitting there with Edward Henning or John Reynolds or Matthew Capstein or any number of these people who were translators and scholars. Some of the old Bodha people, Dutch Ava or Bodha Lin or Dharma Dan, these people whose epithets, Ten Tom, Dutch Bob, people who had been around the area, whether they were Buddhists or not, they were interested in Tibetan culture, and it was this unbelievable exchange of ideas, and also an exchange of some teachings and translations, if they existed. And in those days, I mean, now we have Westerners who have accomplished so much. And when I say accomplished, I don't mean they've scored points or gained notoriety in a negative sense. I mean that they have experience in the Dharma, where they've done 3-year retreats, where they speak and read fluent Tibetan, where they've done translations, where they can talk about the subjects. And some of the great treatises, the great books of Tibetan Buddhism, have been translated 1, 2, 3 times. Translators like Sankhya Khandro, who was actually at the Kagyu Natso, and people like that who have shared and who have refined these translations, and not just on their own, but in conjunction and in collaboration with learned Tibetan scholars who also have learned to speak English and who's also have learned to talk about these subjects in different languages. And in those days, very little of this existed. Very little. To get a translation of your Nundro was gold. And now so much has changed, and it's remarkable. Jakob Leschi, who later came to Bodha later, and who wasn't at those Wongs, is an example of someone he's a resident teacher in Australia. I believe he's now in Switzerland as well, but he has done so much. Eric Pema Kunzong, I first met him at the Kagyu Natso. He had come out with a group of Danes from Europe, and they sat through these initiations. And so many of those people are still friends, Dharma friends and compatriots from so long ago. Anyway, the days went on, the Wongs finished, and it came time to make decisions about where to go, what to do next, to stay in Nepal or whatever. So I was talking to someone, and I'm sorry, I don't remember who it was, but they said, well, why don't you go ask His Holiness? Well, see, that concept never would dawn on me that I would go ask the Karmapa about what to do in my personal life. But I did. So my friend Phoebe and I, and a number of probably 3 or 4 other people, Michael Adamek, Martin Zelansky, Bruce Newman. Now, Bruce himself, he's a Lama. He's completed his 3-year retreat. Martin, I imagine, is up in the wilds of British Columbia doing Dzogchen. Michael Adamek lives in Victoria, Australia, where he has a small Dharma center and has a neighborhood of Dharma practitioners. This is all going on over these years. But at this time, we walked up and we went upstairs, and His Holiness Karmapa would see us, and we sat in front of him. And one by one, we asked him, Your Holiness, what should we do now? And oddly enough, he said to me, you should go see Kamtrul Rinpoche in Tashi, Jong, a Drukpa Kagyu master. He said the same thing to my friend Phoebe. To Martin, he said, go to Manali. To Bruce, I'm not sure. I remember. To Michael Adamek, go to Manali and study at Apo Rinpoche's monastery. So almost all of those people were sent to study with Drukpa Kagyu masters. That's what happened. So we said goodbye to His Holiness and went back to our house. And I think probably a couple of weeks later, we got our Indian visas and we set off for Tashi, which is where Kampagar Monastery is. And that's the seat of Kyabje Kamtrul Rinpoche. And Dorzong Rinpoche, Chogyal Rinpoche, Chodron Rinpoche were all affiliated with that monastery at that time. And what should I call it? The school, the residency of the Togden lineage, who are the holders and practitioners of the lineages of Narochudro, the 6 yogas in Europa, and are known for the Trulkor and Salom practice. And they have a separate area from the side of things up the hill. Anyway, so we arrived in Tashi, and at that time, Kampo Rinpoche was giving a loan, and I'm not exactly sure, but I have a feeling that not too long before we got there, His Holiness Dingo Khyentse Rinpoche had given the Dhamma Tzu, which is another collection of Jong Kontra, one of his 5 treatises. And at that time, many Drukpa Kagyu lamas had gone for, and young Tukus had gone for those initiations. I have a feeling that Kampo Rinpoche had been giving the loan for that series. And when we arrived, we couldn't see him for a couple days. And we were starting to understand that in the Tibetan custom, that Westerners must learn patience and learn to wait, because it's not like going into the supermarket or calling the delivery for fast food. This is the Dharma, so it's worth waiting for. So Kampo Rinpoche finally saw us one day at lunch break. He was sitting up on his seat, and we went in and we explained to him that we'd been sent to by His Holiness Karmapa, and that His Holiness had suggested we ask for Nundro teachings. And Kampo Rinpoche said, I can't give you those now. I'm busy. He said, so why don't you go to the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives in Dharamshala, which was an hour bus ride away or so, hour or 2 bus ride away. He said, and study there. He said, I hear that Geshe Nawang Dargye, who is the head teacher at the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives, is currently teaching the Jewel Ornament of Liberation, which is a treatise by Gampopa, who was a significant player, or I should say a significant teacher in the Drukpa Kagyu and the Kamsang Kagyu. And he said, that's a very, very good thing to study. So off we went. So at this time it was Phoebe, my friend Phoebe, and my friend Mick Bandy. And this is the same Mick Bandy who I had been staying with down in Melbourne, who had done some meditation teachings at Kopap. So we went to Dharamshala, and we looking for a house, and we fell into one of the best houses there on the side of the hill with beautiful views away from the top, the library, away from the McLeod Ganj, and also away from the Lower Bazaar, which were both busy places. Beautiful views, perfect. And I remember it also had polished concrete floors, which was very good for prostrations. So we went back, and we went up to the library, and we started to take the teachings from Nawang Dargye. And it was a wonderful atmosphere. There were a lot of Westerners there, scholars of all different types. I met Alexander Berzin there. I met Jonathan Landau there. They were 2 of the principal translators at the library, and they had produced many, many, many pamphlets and small booklets on Tibetan Buddhism. And it was really significant to meet them. And we met a number of other people. Brian Beresford was also a translator. He was a New Zealander, a photographer. And these people I would realize I would meet in and out of the Dharma over the next decade. And it was a extended sangha of people from different sects, different ideas, but everyone was exchanging ideas and information, because it was rare and scarce. Again, it was the language barrier. All of us, or most of us, the people that I'm speaking about, our native languages were English, or the Europeans all spoke English. So anyway, so we completed the teachings of Jewel Ornament of Liberation, and we went back to Tashi. And when we got to Tashi, we met Annie Jimba Pamo and Annie Lodro Pamo. And His Holiness Kampo Rinpoche ordained 4 Western nuns. Tenzin Palmo, who people will know. She's a highly regarded teacher and famous for her, I shouldn't say famous, she's respected for her years of 12 years of retreat up in, up in Kelong, near Kelong, outside of Kelong in Lahul, north of the Baralacha Pass in northern India. Annie Jimapamo, who is, well, an amazing person and translator and a longtime student of Kampo Rinpoche and Dingo Khyentse Rinpoche. Annie Loderpomo, who also is the same, and Dujun Pomo, who all of these young, well, they're not young now like me, these Western students were very significant in the history of the early times of the spread of Buddha Dharma. And I'm not saying that I was in the early times, because the early times were, Sven Hayden, Evans Wentz, Lama Govinda, Alexander David Neal, Heinrich Harrer, the first people who had associations with Tibetan Buddhism and who brought out information. Lama Govinda. Not all of it was accurate, but then Snellgrove was another. And then early students of His Holiness Dujun Rinpoche and Jamyang Chenji Chochi Lodro, those early students who hung out in Sikkim, and like Keith Dowman and others of that period. They were early, and we were sort of, I guess, the second or third wave, but it was still early, relatively early days as far as the availability of information. So we went to see Kanto Rinpoche, and he said, I still can't teach you, but I found someone who can. And we waited a few more days, and then he summoned us and he said, please come. And he asked Annie Lodopamo to take us up to receive some teachings. So we walked up the hill, up the hill, up the hill, and we walked up to the quarters where, and the Bebakam, where the Togdens trained and lived. And we walked down a path, and there was a little house there, and she tapped on the door, and a little voice said, come in. And we opened the door, and there was Togden Rinpoche, and he was in retreat, and he was sitting in his narrow chodro skirt with his hair tied up, with his meditation band, sitting in his posture, staring into space. And he just came down and he looked, and she explained to him that Kamto Rinpoche had asked him to give us the teachings on this particular Lundro. And he said, yeah, 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 yeah. And just like totally relaxed. I mean, what can I say? We all crowded into the small room. There were 3 or 4 of us, and he proceeded to give the teachings on the Drukgyal Nundro. Kumna Tenzin, I believe, was the author of that Nundro, a previous incarnation of Kampa Rinpoche. I hope I'm not wrong. Yeah. Anywho, we received the teachings from him, and of course, immense blessings, and we were speechless. The kindness of the gurus, quote unquote, Kampa Rinpoche, I'm too busy now to give you the teachings, but I have found someone else who will do it. And we didn't know what to expect. We had no idea he was going to send us to a realized Buddhist saint. Also for the initiations were, say, Drukpa Tukse Rinpoche, the young Drukchen Rinpoche, Situ Rinpoche. This is my friend Ward, and I shook hands at Chinli Norbu, and for the first time laid my eyes on the great master. And then we had heard that Kyabji Dujun Rinpoche was going to give the Dujun Tersar Wongs in Bodhanath, because of it was rare that these initiations were given, and this was Dujun Rinpoche himself giving them. So it was absolute magic. Every night, Lotus Stupa was covered in butter lambs. His Holiness Nigo Khyentse Rinpoche gave a long series of initiations, mainly to the young Tulkus. Nanki Ningpo Rinpoche, Sonsar Khyentse Rinpoche. I mean, he goes Ana, Garu Dorje Rinpoche, Jabal Dorje Rinpoche. So many of the Ponlop Rinpoche, Lakshol Rinpoche, on and on and on. All his young men and young boys, in fact. Situ Rinpoche